Welcome back. Find a comfortable seat. Take a slow breath. Tonight, I want you to imagine something with me. It is the middle of the night. The air is freezing. A line of soldiers is climbing, quietly, up the side of a cliff that no one believed a person could climb. One wrong step, and a man falls into the darkness below. But they keep climbing, because by morning, everything about this land is going to change. We will come back to this moment. I promise you that. But to understand why these men were climbing that cliff in the dark, we have to go back much further than that night. We have to go back to a time before anyone called this land Canada at all. Long before any ship arrived from Europe, this land was not empty. It was full of forests, full of rivers, full of people. Hundreds of different nations lived here. Not one people, but hundreds, each with its own language and its own way of life. Some fished by the ocean. Some followed the great herds across open plains. Some lived deep in the forest, in long wooden houses. Some made their homes where the winter never really ended. They knew this land the way you know your own home. They knew when the fish would return to the rivers. They knew which plants could heal you and which ones could not. For thousands of years, this was simply how life worked here. Then, slowly, ships began arriving from across the ocean. Around the year 1000, Norse sailors reached the eastern coast, led by a man named Leif Erikson. They built a small settlement and stayed only a short while before sailing home. For centuries afterward, Europe seemed to forget this land existed at all. Then, in 1534, a French sailor named Jacques Cartier arrived, searching for a new route to Asia. He never found Asia. Instead, he found a wide river, and along its banks, he met the Iroquois people, who used a word, Kanata, simply meaning village. Cartier misunderstood the word to mean the whole land, and the name stuck. That is how this entire country ended up named after one small word for village. Cartier came looking for gold. He found none. But a few decades later, another Frenchman, Samuel de Champlain, arrived with a different goal. He didn't want to just look and leave. He wanted to stay. In 1608, Champlain built a small settlement at a place the Iroquois called Quebec. The winters nearly destroyed it. Many of his settlers died from cold and sickness in the very first years. But Champlain learned from the people who already lived there. He built friendships and trading partnerships, especially in the fur trade. And slowly, his small settlement grew into something bigger, a colony the French called New France. For a while, this worked. But New France was not the only country with its eyes on this land. While the French were building their colony along the St. Lawrence River, the British were building their own colonies to the south. Both empires wanted the same things: land, fur, and power. And when they couldn't agree, they went to war. The fighting crossed the ocean and landed right here, on Canadian soil. For years, French and British soldiers fought for control of these rivers and forests, and Indigenous nations were pulled into a war that was never really theirs. By 1759, the war had come down to one city, Quebec. The French believed the city was safe, protected by cliffs too steep for any army to climb. They were wrong. This is the night I told you about at the beginning. British soldiers, led by a general named James Wolfe, found a narrow, hidden path up those cliffs. In total darkness, they climbed. By sunrise, thousands of British soldiers stood on an open field just outside the city walls, a field called the Plains of Abraham. The battle that followed lasted only about 15 minutes. 15 minutes. That's all it took. Both generals, Wolfe for the British, Montcalm for the French, were wounded in the fighting, and both later died from those wounds. And with that one short, brutal battle, New France fell into British hands. You might expect what happened next to be simple. The winners take everything, and the French language and culture slowly disappear. But that isn't what happened. In 1774, the British government passed a law called the Quebec Act. Instead of forcing the French settlers to abandon their language and religion, the law allowed them to keep both. French Canadians could keep their language, their Catholic faith, and their own legal traditions. This decision still shapes Canada today. To this day, Canada has two official languages, French and English, existing side by side, not always in perfect harmony, but always together in the same country. Canada kept growing after that. When the American colonies broke away from Britain in 1776, thousands of people who stayed loyal to the British Crown moved north instead, building new towns across the eastern provinces. Slowly, piece by piece, separate British colonies began to wonder if they might be stronger as one. On July 1, 1867, several of these colonies joined together and formed a new country, the Dominion of Canada. This day, Confederation Day, is still celebrated as Canada's birthday. The new country was enormous, so large that it needed a way to hold itself together. So Canada built a railway stretching across the entire continent, from ocean to ocean. Thousands of workers, many of them from China, blasted through mountains and laid tracks across thousands of kilometers of wilderness, often for far less pay than other workers received, and often at a terrible human cost. When the final piece of track was hammered into place in 1885, Canada was, for the first time, physically connected from coast to coast. As settlers moved west, Indigenous nations who had lived on these plains for thousands of years lost access to the buffalo herds their lives depended on, and lost much of the land itself. It is one of the most painful parts of this story, and an honest history of Canada has to include it. In the 20th century, Canada was tested twice by World War. In the First World War, more than 600,000 Canadians served, and at a battle called Vimy Ridge in 1917, Canadian soldiers achieved something other armies could not. For many people, that battle is remembered as the moment Canada stopped feeling like a British colony and started feeling like its own nation. A generation later, in the Second World War, Canadian soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day and helped liberate towns across Europe. In the Netherlands especially, people never forgot what Canada did for them. Even now, every single year, the Dutch send tulips to Canada as a thank you. Today, Canada is known around the world for something very different from war, for being open, polite, and welcoming. Millions of people from every part of the world have made new homes here, and Canada has grown into one of the most multicultural countries on Earth. But Canada also carries its past honestly. For generations, Indigenous children were taken from their families and forbidden from speaking their own languages. In a painful chapter the country is still working to understand and repair. A country, like a person, is never really finished. It keeps learning. It keeps growing. Think back to those soldiers climbing the cliff in total darkness. They had no idea what kind of country would eventually grow out of that single, 15-minute battle. They couldn't have imagined the railway, the two world wars, or the millions of people from every corner of the world who would one day call this land home. That's history for you. The biggest stories usually start with a handful of people in the dark, taking one uncertain step at a time. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If you learned something new, tell me in the comments which parts surprised you most. And if you'd like to keep learning English through true stories like this one, you know where to find me. I'll see you in the next story.